afternoon once again. Thank you all for reassembling on time. Now we have the session 3, which is titled Asia Pacific, Perspectives from Southeast and East Asia. And in our panel, we have Vice Admiral Vijay Shankar, who would be chairing the session. He's the adjunct faculty ISSSP NIAS. And among our panelists, we have speaker Ambassador Hemant Krishan Singh, who's former ambassador to Japan and Indonesia and chair professor at ICRIER Wadhwani US chair. He'll be giving the perspectives from Southeast Asia. And our second speaker is Professor K.V. Kesavan, the distinguished fellow at ORF, who will be presenting the perspectives from Japan. Handing over to the chair.
Thank you very much, Aditi. Firstly, I know it's going to be a difficult proposition to concentrate for any length of time, especially after such a lunch. So since there are only backbenchers here, you're welcome to take a quick ziz as long as it's not noticeable. I consider myself privileged to be here sitting on this chair with such eminent speakers as Hemant Singh and Professor Keshavan. I don't want to take too much time because we are a little behind the clock, but there are a couple of issues that the speakers, I'm sure, will address. The first of this is that with the coming of a new power, as Machiavelli so famously put it, with the coming of a new power, the first instinct of that new power is to rewrite the rule book. And we can see semblances of this occurring as far as China is concerned. And I'm sure the speakers will address that issue as to how the rule book is being rewritten. Not that the rule book does not require to be rewritten, but the fact is that is the first impulse. The second issue is that with the coming of what was termed as competitive resource excess, with the building up of forces to implement strategies such as the excess denial, you can see that in China's larger game plan, there are issues that were not there. That is, if they are to protect their sea lines of communication, if they are there to protect their areas of interest, which includes vast seas that have disputed territories, we've got to see that the upping of the ante is already occurring right as we speak. The creation of this new ADIZ, remember the ADIZ has no legal backing, something started by America, followed by 8 other countries, including Pakistan and India. But the principle has always been, even amongst antagonists, that don't overlap your ADIZs, because there would be confusion of control, and if it's safety that you're trying to address, you're going to set up a recipe for an accident. The second issue is that China must get real if they offer explanations like, we are expecting a surprise attack. I think that is a little absurd to think in this day and age there's going to be a surprise attack. Having said that, I will not hold you back from the speakers. May I please request Ambassador Hemant Singh to kindly take the rostrum and make his presentation.
Thank you, Chair, and very good afternoon. I hope that I can keep myself actively engaged through my remarks. And thank you, Leela, for being one part of the story which triggers my visit to Bangalore, because you're quite responsible for bringing me back to focus on issues which deal with Southeast Asia. Let me cover 3 or 4 aspects in my remarks. Let me begin by giving you just a brief idea of the post-Cold War power dynamics in Southeast and East Asia, and a couple of points about the main challenges which the region faces. And then I'll move on to the positions of the Southeast Asian countries, at least insofar as the subject matter of this seminar goes. And finally, I'll end up with a few ideas about prospects for a regional security order and possible principles for a regional security order. To begin with the introduction, post-Cold War you saw the start of ASEAN-led initiatives to establish dialogue forums, which approached security as a cooperative and inclusive venture. And this was quite a change. It was a novel departure from the traditional competitive security arrangements which have traditionally existed and still in some areas of the world continue to exist. At the same time, the US-led hub-and-spoke system coexisted with this up-and-coming dialogue process and, without a doubt, served as a stabilizing force. And somehow the post-Cold War dynamics of relative unipolarity also helped maintain stresses and strains on order and stability in Southeast and East Asia. The significance of the emergence of the EAS, one of the key craftsmen of that exercise, Rajiv Sikri, is not with us today, but I must point that out as well at this juncture, because the evolution of the EAS after 20 years of intense contestation between how to bring about some kind of security architecture or integration in Asia, which began in the early 1990s. It ended up with the EAS, it ended up with the inclusion of India, and it ended up moving beyond geographically delimited regional community based on the ASEAN Plus 3 model, which China and Malaysia had very strongly urged up to then. Nonetheless, but we see that after it was founded in 2005, the progress of the EAS has been somewhat arrested. It has still has a marginal soft security role, has not really lived up to potential. Now, coming closer to the last 2 or 3 years, the far-reaching changes in the strategic weight within the broader region and between the region and other major power centers of the world has heightened the scale and complexity of security challenges facing this part of Asia, not only for us who are part of the region, but also for the rest of the world. And there are clear signs of intensifying strategic competition among regional states, military modernization, much of it has been referred to. Security challenges clearly are intensifying. One fact stands clear today, that is, economic interdependence alone cannot ensure peace. And to the contrary, the continued economic progress of this region depends on a reliably stable geopolitical order being brought about. Hence the need to build the kind of multilateral processes, security processes, which many have talked about, including our own PM, to facilitate the socialization of security issues and the development of normative frameworks that provide space for collective and cooperative action. The EAS, if I can say, as a leaders-led forum, which includes all the powers with an interest and a regional presence in this part of the world, has the capacity to eventually evolve and uphold the regional security order once such an order is multilateralized and comes into being. Few remarks about the main challenges of the region. We have states with different characteristics whose interaction poses and creates great complexities. And I'm not talking about social disparities and economic disparities. I'm really talking about political systems. And this is not an Europe where you can start building a regional security order based on certain commonalities. Second, the powers in the region have varying capabilities. Some are large, some are small, some are established, some are emerging. There are status quo powers and there are contrarian powers which want to change everything. So there is a large stress on the security of the region. Also, there is uncertainty about the US rebalance, about which we have heard. There's too much of strategic ambiguity for friends and allies, and also too much of strategic reassurance, perhaps, for China. In fact, the uncertainties about the US pivot or rebalance, I would argue, is today becoming a factor of instability in the region. The main challenge, however, in Southeast and East Asia is China's territorial assertions, its unilateral coercive actions, accompanied by a significant upgradation of its military power and presence. And you saw that happen, that impinge on ASEAN when its cohesion collapsed in 2012. You see that in the stalled process of Code of Conduct on the South China Sea. These are all symptoms of what I call China's assertive rise. And with this background, regional states across the board are reassessing the security matrix, including Australia, which once very strongly wanted to support a condominium between the US and China. Now let me move on to the states of the region, just touch upon their broad trends of security policy at the moment. Australia, to begin with, the traditional approach has been always Asia-Pacific in nature, going back to the 1930s when Australia, US, and Japan tried to bring about some kind of a security architecture for this region, which was based on trans-Pacific constructs. Hence, Australia has pioneered the APEC. It talked about the APC, which went nowhere. Nevertheless, since 2013 and its white paper on defense, Australia started to develop an Indo-Pacific orientation, which implies an arc extending from India across Southeast Asia all the way up to Northeast Asia. And Australia has also recognized in this process the destabilizing strategic competition which is confronting powers in the region, and the threat of coercive actions by some powers which remain unstated in the white paper, but it's quite clear who is being referred to. There is nonetheless no indication in that white paper of 2013 that Australia will work with regional partners to maintain strategic equilibrium as China's power rises. And this obviously, from India's perspective, is a big negative. Under the new government, Australia has focused more on multilateral security constructs. It has increased Australia-Japan-US triangulation on security issues facing the East. Its criticism of China's ADIZ in the East China Sea has been quite blunt, and unusually blunt for Australia, in fact. Nonetheless, Australia's recent interventions have created a huge amount of tension between Australia and Indonesia over the Stop the Boats program, and the Australian Navy is busy sending refugee boats back into, pushing them physically back into Indonesian waters. Indonesia has virtually stopped speaking to Australia. There's a big Cold War kind of a situation emerging there. And the result of that has been that the Chinese have taken advantage, taken the permission of the Indonesians, and conducted a full naval exercise in waters which separate Indonesia and Australia. Hopefully, this kind of a let-off for the Chinese will not continue, but it does show two things. First, that there are difficulties in integrating Australia within these structures, and especially given its very tense relationship with Indonesia, and Indonesia being the leader among ASEAN, this is not something which can be just allowed to pass. And the second is that perhaps, as other observers have suggested, it is completely, let's say, it's not worthwhile to continue to say that the Indian Ocean region, the South China Sea and the East China Sea are neatly quarantined segments and military theaters. Many observers thought that this exercise which the Chinese conducted in the waters south of Indonesia was a sign that China is now becoming Indo-Pacific in its orientation as well. Moving to Indonesia, response of Indonesia to regional security issues, to summarize, they call it dynamic equilibrium. This dynamic equilibrium has four constructs within it. First is to build systems where there is greater trust and there's greater amount of norm setting among countries. Second, to create a web of multiple ASEAN-led frameworks in which all 18 countries of the EAS, for example, have an equal stakeholding. The third is to avoid grand coalitions of any kind in the region. Fourth is to provide space to regional powers to fashion their own security responses. Creating an Indo-Pacific TAC, IP TAC as it's called, based on TAC principles, is another aspect of Indonesia's recent initiatives. Fundamentally, dynamic equilibrium is an euphemism for a balance of power achieved by other means and retaining a measure of autonomy for powers of the region. Moving on to Malaysia. Since the early 1990s, it is well known that Malaysia generally has supported regional constructs and architecture which tend to favor China, whether it was EAEG to begin with, moving on to the APT. And mind you, if 2005 we did not have the EAS, by today we could very well have had a APT-based East Asian community. However, everybody thought that Malaysia's stakes in the South China Sea were not that high till recently. And the Chinese have shaken up this sense of complacency by declaring unequivocally in January 2014 that they have indisputable sovereignty over the James Shoal and conducting a second round of naval exercises there. So there has been an emerging nuance in the Malaysian position. This has just tended to accelerate that nuance. The policy on regional security architecture, on the code of conduct with in the South China Sea, and coordination within ASEAN to promote these ideas, this has gained saliency for Malaysia. They are also building a naval base near the James Shoal, I believe. Also, Philippines and Malaysia together very recently held a summit which came out in strong support of a code of conduct and peaceful settlement of disputes in the South China Sea. Moving to the Philippines, just 2 or 3 points. Well, we all know about the Scarborough Shoal, what happened there after a tense standoff. And there's, thank you, sir. I'll try to speed up. The Philippines, as a strong has become a strong proponent of multilateral frameworks and a binding code of conduct for the South China Sea. It has sought arbitration of its maritime territorial dispute with China, which China has not liked. It has received a certain amount of security assistance from Japan. It's moving in the direction of new security arrangements with the US, but there are limitations to that. I can answer that later when we come to the question and answers. Continental ASEAN, Cambodia, Laos, they're closely aligned to the Chinese positions on security issues. Myanmar's attempts to fashion a more independent position will be tested this year as it chairs ASEAN. Vietnam is possibly the only continental ASEAN country with a certain capability to counter China and Chinese pressures. Here I have 2 more points to make. One, the Paracels and Spratlys. These claims which China has made, if you go back to history and go back to the maps, and Professor Kondapalli is the best man to tell us about this, all those islands are shown as French territories because France owned Vietnam. It was a colonial master of Vietnam. I'll skip Singapore and Thailand except to say that both of them are hedged towards China, but with a curious addition or element of having a security relationship with the United States. I wanted to say something about Japan, but I can say it later when we come to the question and answer. But all that I'd like to add at this stage is that as Korea moves closer to China and hardens its posture towards Japan on history issues, the US is finding it impossible to progress a Japan-Korea-US security collaboration type of a construct. And this is causing a huge amount of strain in East Asian security, Northeast Asian security. I foresee that the new US-Japan military cooperation guidelines, as well as a revised opinion of the Japanese government on collective self-defense, both these things will come about in the next 2 or 3 months. Security architecture. principles and constructs. Well, ASEAN has to prove its centrality. If it is...
May I request you to wind up?
Okay, all right. If ASEAN wishes to be central, it needs to develop a clear roadmap for a rule-based regional security architecture by defining core competencies of the 3 or 4 organizations under ASEAN which handle security, by giving a stronger role to the EAS, and by imparting some amount of collective ownership over the EAS process for the non-ASEAN partners. And the principles, of course, will come along with this, and most of those principles are things which India can very happily support and live with. I'll mention only 2. Renunciation of coercive measures, not just use or threat of force, but renunciation of coercive measures in the settlement of disputes. The second one is open, inclusive, evolutionary processes which India supports to build norms of cooperative behavior in the region. I'll end there, but of course I think there are some of these elements which short term, our focus has to remain on getting a security framework to ensure peace and prosperity in the region so that our economic progress of East Asia can continue, and building an East Asia community is in the long term, but in the meanwhile, at least some progress on a regional security order will address a part of the stress on the order and stability which the region presently faces. Thank you.